and I'd like to welcome you to a really exciting talk in the Iran Colloquium. And of course, it has to happen that my phone starts to ring at this time too, so I'm sorry for that. The Iran Colloquium series is part of the Yale Program for Iranian Studies. And I'd like to thank the organizers as well as the Council for Middle East Studies and the Macmillan Center here at Yale for their support. I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Dominic Parviz Brookshaw, who is a faculty of Oriental Studies at Oxford University, who is joining us and speaking about his book. Let me tell you a little bit about him first. He is an associate professor of Persian literature at the University of Oxford and a senior research fellow in Persian at Wadham College, also in Oxford. From 2011 to 2013, he was assistant professor of Persian and comparative literature at Stanford. He currently serves on the editorial board of Middle East Studies, Middle Eastern Literatures, and for a decade was the assistant editor for Iranian Studies. We're really excited to hear about his latest book, Hafiz and His Contemporaries, Poetry, Performance, and Patronage in 14th Century Iran. This came out last year in 2019 and was awarded the Saidi Sirjani Book Award by the Association for Iranian Studies this summer in July 2020. Now, I have had the pleasure of reading this book, which is just really incredible, probably one of the most exciting books on early modern Iran or medieval Iran that has come out in the past decade, I would say. It's really groundbreaking in its aspirations, but also in what it does. As he writes himself, part of the goal is to take who is possibly one of the most well-known poets of the Persian language, Hafiz Shirazi, who is, on some sense, his divan, his ghazals, and all are considered almost the epitome of the language. The books are talismanic. They are used in Iran, for example, to tell the future. He has been considered almost in this anachronistic way, the national poet, if you will, of Iran. But we don't know enough about this person. And what Professor Brookshaw's book does so beautifully and so well written, that he contextualizes Hafiz and puts the work into its poetic context, into its cultural, and most importantly, its historical context. And in so doing, he actually sets up and introduces us not just to Hafiz, but to his contemporaries, such as Nizamuddin Ubaidullah Zakani, the fantastically interesting Panegyris, and an incredibly interesting Injuit princess, Jahan Malik Khatun. Now, we also, again, had known not enough about women poets of the early modern period, and Professor Brookshaw's work sheds light on other circles beyond Hafiz that really contributed and in many ways make him even more exceptional in the way in which he negotiates his word, negotiates his moment, and the way also in which the poetry, not only how it's made, but how it circulates. Now, for someone who works on the early modern period, but in the visual cultures of Iran, Hafiz is central, but also the way in which his work is received and presented from the 16th, 15th, and 16th century onwards. So to see how the Majlis, for example, functioned within the context of Hafiz and his contemporaries, to understand how the poetry was circulated, but also how evocative and central it becomes to the visual cultures, to the literary cultures, but even to the religious cultures of Iran, both in the early modern period, and I would argue up until today. This work is exciting, and I'm so delighted and grateful to have the author here with us. So welcome, Professor Brookshaw. I'm going to open it up to you now.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that gracious introduction, Kishwar. It's wonderful to join you, unfortunately not in person because of the circumstances, but it's wonderful to be able to say something about my book for Yale and for the Colloquium. I should, of course, first thank Abbas Amonat and Farbode Honar Pisher for their very kind invitation and for making me part of this term series of really wonderful talks at Yale. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to try and share my screen with you so that you don't see me too much, but rather some slides that I've prepared. So hopefully you can see that. My book is a study of Persian poetry at a specific time in a particular place, post-Mongol Shiraz, a city of approximately 60,000 people that had immense cultural reach. Shiraz's literary network stood at the heart of a trans-regional grid of poets active across the major cities of 14th century Iran and Iraq, who shared a common poetic koine. My research is inspired by work that locates texts within specific social sites and uncovers the impulses that create moment-specific cultural discourse. I reread Hafiz through a sober lens and examine his oeuvre as part of a larger organic whole, not as an exceptional corpus that requires a singular reading. I believe it's only through comparative textual study that is at once loco-specific, trans-regional, and intergeneric that a more balanced picture of the poet will emerge. Though my emphasis is on the courtly and the profane, I in no way seek to deny the mystical depth of Hafiz's Ghazals. But whether we wish to label Hafiz a professional poet or not, we cannot dispute that he enjoyed nourishing relationships with a long line of Shiraz's rulers and their chief courtiers over 4 long decades. As Mongol rule weakened in the first quarter of the 14th century, Iran and Iraq gradually fractured into smaller units governed by local dynasties, many of which emerged from families who had served the Ilkhanids. 2 such dynasties competed for control of post-Mongol Shiraz, first the Injuids and then the Muzaffarids. These families sought to do battle with one another over the control of other key cities on the Iranian plateau, and at times they ruled significant tracts of former Ilkhanid lands. They made alliances with one another, which of course they frequently broke, and they bridged their political divide through strategic marriages. The turbulent 14th century was a period of intense cultural exchange between the city-states of Iran and Iraq. Poets enjoyed increased mobility, with the cultural pull of Shiraz and after Shiraz, Baghdad, being strongest. The first Muzaffarid king of Shiraz, the reportedly severe and pious Mubaraz ad-Din, is said to have been largely uninterested in Persian letters. But in contrast, his son, Shah Shuja, fostered in Shiraz an atmosphere conducive to the arts, which revived the cultural practices of Hafiz's first royal patron, the last Injuid, Shah Sheikh Abu Ishaq. But Shah Shuja was not only a connoisseur of poetry, he was himself a poet of some talent and an educated critic of poetry. When Shah Shuja died in 1384, Hafiz was more than 60 years old. Nevertheless, the seasoned court poet went on to seek new patrons, most notably the nephews of his late master, who ruled in Yazd and at Shiraz, and who were executed by Timur in the 1390s, just a few years after Hafiz's own death. In Persian, the term tarbiyat, which normally means training or educating, can also be used to denote patronage. Pre-modern court poets in the Islamic world exchanged their loyalty and literary services for protection, regular stipends, and/or one-off payments. The professional poet strove to establish and maintain a close bond with the royal patron he flattered, and thereby to accrue social cultural recognition and literary capital. Poets might be associated with a specific court, of course, or else might have moved within a broader, more fluid network. Poets and other writers who became disappointed in one city would move on in search of a more favorable reception elsewhere. The mushrooming of multiple local royal patronage nodes in the wake of the collapse of Mongol rule encouraged greater mobility in some poets, and it helps explain the large amount of court poetry produced in the region from about the year 1330 up to 1390. The ruler, as chief benefactor, could make or break the panegyrist's career through the granting or, of course, the withholding of his generosity. The patron's largesse conferred prestige upon himself or, in some cases, herself. And the patronage of literary culture, of course, was emblematic of good governance. Royal patrons sought immortality for their name and were prepared to provide handsome rewards to poets who might preserve their good reputation for posterity. As Charlotte has highlighted, relations between poets and patrons were fraught with risks, not least because of the competitive, precarious environment in which they were nurtured and the disparity in the social status of the two parties. In Persian panegyrics, the poet-patron relationship is often depicted using the language of love and motifs of desire. The poet-lover seeks to foster intimacy with and elicit favor from the distant patron beloved. Here is an example in my translation of a panegyric Ghazal by Hafiz for Shah Shuja. As you can see, it has 8 baits or 8 lines. And what I would like us to focus on, although by all means read the full translation, is really the last 2 baits, bait 7 and bait 8. As a panegyric, like all panegyrics really, this is in essence an occasional poem, a one-time poem linked to a specific event perhaps. In this case, it's a little bit broader and might reflect a specific period in the reign of Shah Shuja, who reigned for a long period in Shiraz, or a particular period in the relationship between Hafiz and Shah Shuja. Hafiz in this poem depicts his devotion to Shah Shuja, and through Shah Shuja to the Muzaffarid court, and to, of course, in a broader sense, Shiraz itself. In the last bait, where in my translation it says, "May God never separate Hafiz's forehead and cheek from the dust of the threshold of the magnificent court of Shah Shuja," Hafiz is, in a sense, not only devoting himself to his patron, to the immediate, holy, sanctified space around the patron, but through that space to Shiraz, to Fars as a whole. In a sense, a part here, the part being the court, the royal court, and the person of the ruler, represents the entirety of the Muzaffarid realm. I share this with you to argue for a way of reading Hafiz that is not outside of time, that is linked to specific occasions, specific tensions, either at court or between the poet and his patron or patrons, and to a very specific context, which is something I will go on to talk about. It is through topographical allusions to localities couched in extravagant praise that Hafiz and his contemporaries manifest their patriotic attachment to and pride in Shiraz. These loco-descriptive poems, known collectively as Shiraziyat, are infused with an intense love of place, and they demonstrate a dynamic connection between spaces evoked in poetry and the reality of the political and cultural situation that the poets themselves worked to fashion. The fabric of a city, its palaces, its parks, and other created landscapes constitute a kind of stage for conveying regal power. In addition to shaping Shiraz's built environment, rulers displayed their power through patronizing panegyrics that conveyed the city's intoxicating allure, presenting it as a welcoming abode of perfect bliss, in particular for poets, but also for others, and establishing it once and for all as the source of the finest Persian poetry. And just to focus in on Shiraz, I'll show you another map that gives you a sense of Shiraz in relation to the most important cities within its kind of orbit. In the fragmented post-Mongol political landscape, identification of the ruler with the city and not a wider empire led to a greater focus on Shiraz itself and its dependent territories as a kind of micro-state. When read with sensitivity to the political and patronage-related functions of evocations of place, seemingly hyperbolic or esoteric imagery can be deciphered to show how lyric poems contributed to the creation of the city's environment and its enduring image. Hafiz and the other poets presented Shiraz and the region of Fars, both to those attached to the local court and to those at rival cultural centers, as an earthly paradise at the very heart of the Iranian world. In the lyric poetry of the period, Shiraz, the walled, built-up urban center, plus its outlying satellite villages, meadows, and gardens, is praised as a coherent unit. Praise for one part is praise for the whole, just as praise for the ruler is praise for the city and his broader realm. Poets and other literati believed Shiraz's paradise-like charms to be concentrated in three key iconic sites: the Ruknabad water channel, the Musalla flower meadow, and the fruit orchards of the Jafarabad suburb. These three emotive loci arrested the poets and prevented them from ever truly leaving, drawing them back to Shiraz time and time again through amorous magnetism. Ruknabad, Musalla, and Jafarabad fuel Shiraz's trans-regional pull and excite passionate attachment in locals and outsiders alike. The fixed association of these toponyms and their repeated and significant use across multiple poems penned by a series of Shiraz-based poets, their would-be colleagues, and their literary rivals, facilitated their functioning in a not dissimilar way to, and forgive me for the pronunciation, utamakura, or place names in Japanese poetry. As Kamens tells us, utamakura act as, quote, nodes within a poem through which the maker of that poem reaches out to make contact with other poems or poetic moments, and thereby complicate or enrich the signifying process of that poem as a whole. Ruknabad, Musalla, and Jafarabad are famous precisely, though of course not exclusively, because of their roles in poetry. These three loci, though all on the edge of the city proper, constitute the poetic heart of Shiraz. In the 14th century, these sites provided seclusion for drinking bouts and amorous trysts. It is to these emotive icons that poets turn with greatest frequency when broadcasting Shiraz's unique attractions. Hafiz's best-known evocation of the Ruknabad channel and the Musalla meadow appears in his well-known Turk-Shirazi or Turk of Shiraz Ghazal. بده ساقی می باقی که در جنت نخواهی یافت کنار آب رکناباد و گلگشت مصلا را. Wine server, Give the eternal wine, for in paradise you will not find the banks of the Ruknabad channel and the Mosalla flower meadow. Hafiz ranks Shiraz's earthly, tangible pleasances above the promised paradise garden itself. The wine served, the Meye Baqi, here I have translated as eternal wine, could be rendered the remaining wine, the dregs of the patron's cup being superior to the wine promised in the afterlife. This couplet comes directly after Hafiz's assertion that he would give away the cities of Bukhara and Samarkand for the Hindu or Indian, i.e. jet black beauty spot on his beloved Turk's white cheek. The naming of two locations within the environs of Shiraz, ones that his audience would have enjoyed intimate familiarity with, immediately following the mention of two distant cities, serves to focus the listener's attention on the local and on the here and now. Through stressing the centrality of Ruknabad and its associated pleasure grounds, Hafiz reorients his listener's attention away from the pious nexuses venerated by Sa'di in his most famous ode for the city, towards foci of earthly and erotomystical arousal. There is little evidence that Hafiz himself spent any time away from his hometown. Hafiz uses an allusion to the pull of Shiraz's emotive loci to excuse his inertia. نمی دهند اجازت مرا به سیر سفر نسیم باد مصلا و آب رکناباد. The sweet breeze of Mosalla and the water of Ruknabad, they do not give me permission to wander and travel. The poet is trapped in an amorous entanglement with the city, but he is not the only one. Ubayd Zarqani was an outsider from a small town near to Qazvin in northwestern Iran, who made his literary career in Shiraz. In pre-modern times, patriotism, of course, was a local sentiment, love of terra patria or natal land. Ubayd, like other migrant poets, alludes to his temporary sojourn in Fars and speaks of himself as an outsider, Qarib, who is far from his hometown. For Ubayd, Mosalla and Ruknabad more than compensate for his alien status. نسیم باد مصلا و آب رکناباد غریب را وطن خویش می برد از یاد. The sweet breeze of Mosalla and the water of Ruknabad remove any thought of home from the stranger's memory. Poets had a professional need to belong, and Ubayd must stress he belongs in Shiraz because to be a great poet in the 14th century, one either had to hail from Shiraz, serve Shiraz's court, or if you were based at another court, or if you hailed from another town, you should imitate Sa'di and or his most celebrated successor, Hafiz. As Ingenito has shown, being Shirazi by birth or association through shared patronage or intertextually via imitation was considered a prerequisite for poetic eloquence and authority. In the second bait quoted here, we see that the Kermani poet Emad Kermani, employs references to Shiraz' famed loci in the opening lines of one of his own ghazals. خوشا هوای مصلا و آب رکناباد که مفرح دل و مقوی جان باد. Blessed be the breeze of Mosalla and the water of Ruknabad, for they exhilarate the heart and restore the soul. Emad not only equates Shiraz's verdant environs with paradise, but he also presents them as locations for the royal celebrations of the spring equinox festivities and the feast to mark the end of Ramadan. In the first word of the poem, Khosha, Emad invokes Sa'di's famous Shiraziye that opens Khosha sepide dani anke binam baz. And if indeed Imad composed this particular poem later than Hafiz's famous poem for the city, Khosha Shiraz o Vaz'i bi Misalash. We could see Imad here as, in a way, invoking Hafiz as well as Sa'di. In content, though, Imad's poem follows the counter-pietistic mode of city panegyric typified by Ubayd. The third line quoted here is from a less well-known poet, Haydar Shirazi, who, although Shirazi, spent much of his career in Yazd and composed several poems in praise of Shiraz. In one of these, Haydar appears to quote verbatim from Imad. خوشا نگار گلندام و باغ نوروزی خوشا هوای مصلا و آب رکناباد. Blessed be the rose-limbed beloved and the Nowruz garden. Blessed be the breeze of Musalla and the water of Ruknabad. Interestingly, though, it is not only in the Ghazals of Shirazi poets or poets based in Shiraz that we find allusions to Ruknabad. In an intriguing Ghazal attributed to the Baghdad-based poet Salman Saveji, we also find celebration of this emotive topographical icon. And I read in translation, at the end of a short Ghazal by Salman, he says, I smelled the sweet scent of the beloved's locks, and my heart began to turn crazed with love. It longed for the water of Ruknabad and desired the environs of Shiraz. As Salman's poem demonstrates, Shiraz inspired affection in poets based well beyond the territory of Fars itself. Praise for a city is praise for its ruler, his family, his ministers, and all those who patronize the arts. By praising the city, the poet contributed to the ruler's popularity and ingratiated him or herself with ordinary citizens. And as the poet's verses began to circulate in private majalis and other contexts not directly linked to the court, they eventually filtered down to non-elite spaces such as the tavern and the bazaar, growing the poet's popularity among the common folk. In turn, the poet's status at court would have grown as he or she became seen as an important propagandistic ally. As a result, the poet would have received enhanced or renewed financial reward in recognition of the currency their verses enjoyed among the patron subjects. Shirazi poems distributed beyond Fars spread the fame of the poet as well as that of the patron. It was in large part through poetry that Shiraz came to be revered as a cultural hub, not only by those who lived in other cities in Iran and Iraq, but also far beyond into those regions where Persianate culture thrived. Boosting Shiraz's popularity outside of Fars benefited the ruler and his administration through the promotion of the image of a strong but benevolent ruler and a culturally and economically productive realm. Such literary propaganda would also benefit the city, as other poets, artisans, and scholars would be attracted to settle there in the hope of securing generous patronage. It was not only poets who produced works in praise of 14th century Shiraz. We also have belletristic works lauding the city, its inhabitants, and its unique environs that were written both in the earlier but also the later period in the 14th century. The poets of Shiraz in this time and those active in rival cultural zones worked within local yet deeply interconnected networks of composition, performance, reception, and transmission. These overlapping communities were highly competitive, and poets continually played off one another, all the while treading a fine line between creative imitation, plagiarism, and slavish mimicry. They strove to outdo one another in eloquence and to negotiate a foothold for themselves in the tradition through asserting their status as rightful heirs to the poetic past. As Stetkevich has argued, Poetic imitation is the practice of, quote, the reciprocal validation and authorization of the imitated and the imitator. It is through imitation of both dead and living poets, and through mastering the canon and its generic conventions, that the successful poet made for him or herself a lasting name. Just as with other competitive pre-modern poetry environments, this one in Shiraz and in the broader post-Mongol world in Iran and Iraq was highly self-reflexive. Persian poetic imitation, whether formal, lexical, syntactic, and semantic, is known by various names, including istiqbal, welcoming, tatabbu, pursuit, iqtifa, following, jawabgui, answering or dialoguing, and naziragui, composing parallel or companion poems. Poetic response, which normally involved the adoption of the formal features of the model poem, and often featured direct quotation or tazmin of a line or a key phrase from it, was not considered plagiarism, but rather borrowing. When a poet engages in istiqbal, a demand is made that the new poem be read in dialogue with its source or its model. In such imitation, Lozensky says, we witness the conscious remaking of the literary past. But the towering genius of a canonical poet could, of course, if not negotiated wisely, stifle the talent of an aspiring one, which meant that imitation could only be embarked upon with a deep knowledge of literary heritage. As Lewis cautions, imitation was permissible, even desirable, if the responding poet proved a worthy imitator. In imitation, intertextual acknowledgement of poetic prowess is coupled with an implicit challenge to the poet whose words are being reworked. The imitator presents him or herself as an equal, equipped with the necessary literary skills not only to imitate, but also to interpret and potentially better the work of the predecessor or indeed the contemporary. A junior or less famous poet could, through imitating a recognized past master or a more famous peer, appropriate something of the poet's fame and gain recognition for his or her new poem. As Zipoli has shown, poetic imitation was an initiating test of technical skill used to define one's own generic affiliation. A successful imitation proved that a poet belonged to the tradition. For Jawab, the active cooperation of a competent listener is required, one whose literary connoisseurship allows him or her to recognize and appreciate the intertextual allusions in the response. Since Hafiz was writing with a backdrop of at least 3 centuries of the development of the written Persian Ghazal behind him, it comes as no surprise that it is difficult to detect those elements in his ghazals that cannot be attested in the works of previous poets. Hafiz's commitment to imitating past masters has been classified as excessive by Shami Sah, for example. Hafiz responds in his poetry to many of the masters of earlier centuries, including Rudaki, Amir Mu'izzi, Ambari, Kamal Isfahani, Araqi, and most substantively, Sa'adi. Composing responses to Sa'adi or quoting his poetry verbatim was a prominent feature of 14th century Persian lyric poetry, both inside and outside of Shiraz. Beyond mere quotation, deference is shown to earlier poets through the living poet's unflattering comparison of his or her own poetry to that of the recognized master. Often, though, irreverence is displayed as the post-Mongol poet claims to be in possession of superior eloquence and fame to that of the canonical poets of the past. Pre-modern Persian poets were highly conscious of the poetry being written by others, and Hafiz's ghazals are replete with evidence of mutual intertextual engagement with his peers in Shiraz and his contemporaries elsewhere. Such intense patterns of mutual imitation between peers contributed to the false attribution early on of Hafiz's ghazals to others, or the confusion of theirs with his. Often composing for the same patrons, rival poets engaged in repeated allusion to one another with three key goals as enumerated by Lewis: self-aggrandizement, paying homage, or simply catering to the audience's taste. And here we have three baits again by three different poets. You'll recognize the first, no doubt, as being one of the most famous poems or celebrated poems by Hafiz, and one of the most famous lines from that poem. Allusions to Joseph, to Yusuf, have been employed by Persian poets from at least the 11th century to inspire hope in their addressees by providing reassurance that their present situation will ultimately change for the better. This is the best known example of an allusion to Joseph employed in this manner by Hafiz, and we probably all know this line. The second hemistich of this bait is, though, in fact, a tazmin from the opening line of a Ghazal attributed to the influential Ilkhanid statesman Shamsuddin Muhammad Jovaini, the Sahib Divan, who is responsible for the civil administration of Mongol Iran, a post he held from approximately 2 decades. Shamsuddin Jovaini lavished a good portion of his sizable annual salary on those who crafted impactful written propaganda in praise of him, and he is known to have provided patronage to a host of poets, including Saadi, Majduddin Hamgar, and Humam Tabrizi. Hafiz inserted a tazmin from this bait, which is the second in this slide, by Jovaini, which was the opening line, the matla of his own. Hafiz inserts that into the opening line of his. And so we see the second hemistich of Hafiz's matla comes from this poem by Jovaini. The Kolbe Ahzan Shavad Ruzi Golestan Gam Makhor is originally not by Hafiz, but by an earlier poet of the 13th century. The tone of Hafiz's poem echoes that of Jovaini in its optimism. However uncompromising and negative the current situation may seem, the ultimate outcome will be a positive one, and the phrase Gam Makhor, grieve not, repeated as the radif, the refrain in a way, at the end of each line, infuses the poem with a sense of reassuring calm. Reading comparatively, though, we note that the divan of a contemporary of Hafiz, mentioned by Keshwar Rizvi at the beginning of this talk, the Injuit princess Jahan Malek Khatun, contains 2 ghazals with the exact same rhyme, refrain, and meter. The intertextual dynamics of poetic imitation, the penning of poetic responses, and the composition of parallel poems within and across periods are complex negotiations in terms of literary hierarchy. Jahan composed a bait that shares a half line with that same matla by Hafiz. And you'll see here, the third example, that the second part of the bait by Jahan has Yusuf gum gashte baz ayad be Kan'an gam makhor, which is the way in which Hafiz opens and begins his poem. Given the greater fame of Hafiz, one might be forgiven for assuming this to be a clear-cut case of response or jawab on the part of Jahan. However, it is by no means clear, nor of course will it ever be possible to verify with certainty, who is quoting whom in this intertextual play. It is impossible to know which poet first penned a poem in imitation of Jovaini, and whether the hemistich Yusuf gum gashte baz ayad be Kan'an gam makhor was originally penned by Hafiz or Jahan. But if Jahan did borrow from Hafiz, why would she place the verbatim quotation from him in as insignificant a section of her poem as the second hemistich of the third bait? But what is the deeper intertextual relationship between Jahan's 2 poems and the Ghazal by Giovanni. And in this, hopefully you can see that. Sorry that the font is quite small. But here I have compared between Giovanni, the poem by Hafiz, the two poems by Jahan, and one poem by Salman that is in the same form at least. I have shown where phrases and particular words are repeated and overlap between, there is this overlap in content between these 5 poems, and you can see it's quite substantial. The rhyme and refrain of Jahan's poems appear, of course, to have been inspired by Giovanni's, making her 2 ghazals and that of Hafiz instances of istiqbal, though it is possible that either Jahan or Hafiz may have imitated Giovanni indirectly or even unwittingly through responding to one another. Most interestingly, Salman also composed a ghazal with the same formal features. Dialogue across these 5 poems is facilitated through a shared lexicon of phrases and words, some of which, with very minor tweaks, carry across as many as 4 of the poems. And you can see that, I think, quite clearly here. Whereas, for example, in Giovanni, we have Khare Hejran, the thorn of separation. We have Khare Muqilan in Hafiz, which is a particular kind of thorny bush in the desert. In one of Jahan's poems, we have Khare Muqilan, and in the other, we have Khare Hejran, which indicates, I think, that there is direct imitation from Jahan towards Giovanni, and that it is not going simply through the medium of Hafiz. As you can see, there is a good deal of overlap between the Ghazal of Giovanni and Hafiz's, between Giovanni's and at least one, if not both of Jahan's, and between Giovanni's and Salman's, and between Hafiz's and both of the poems by Jahan in different ways. In addition to the verbatim quotation of a single hemistich from Giovanni's poem and that of Hafiz, and the hemistich that is shared by Hafiz and Jahan, and the evidence of imitation across the 5 ghazals displayed in shared items of vocabulary and phraseology, there is also a great deal that semantically binds this group of poems together, and even others beyond them. Detailed analysis of the relationship between these poems that span more than a century, from around probably 1260 to 1390, proves the existence of a community of poets that existed across as well as within specific historical periods and in at least 2 cities. And I will finish up here by showing you a slide that lists the poets based or who have an active relationship with the court of Shiraz in the post-Mongol period. And you can see all of these I have discussed in this book to a greater or lesser extent. And there is so much relationship between them that it really is quite fascinating. You'll see here, of course, Kamal Khojandi, who was not active in Shiraz, but has a lot of his poetry is responding to Saadi, but also to Hafiz. He's very relevant here. He was based primarily in Tabriz. And Salman Safavid, whose career was primarily in Baghdad, partially in Tabriz as well. But as we've seen, as I've shown you one example, there are many more examples in Salman's poetry where he not only seems to be dialoguing with Saadi and Hafiz in some way, but he seems to imitate a kind of Shirazi style of Ghazal quite often in his own. These poems and many others like them, the ones that talk about the lost Joseph, are evidence of the intertextual literary system at work in 14th century Iran and Iraq, in which erudite audiences would have both recognized and appreciated the intertextual features of the new poems presented to them. The imitative responses to Giovanni's poem show us how Persian poets in the 13th and 14th centuries could be colleagues in pen, if not always in person. And I think most fascinating, they show how Jahan, who was as bold an imitator and responder as any of her male counterparts, was an equal player in this poetic matrix. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dominic. This was really a fascinating and exciting talk. So for the audience, thank you for being here again. We'd be happy to take your questions, and you can type them up in the Q&A section, and I will read them out to Professor Brookshaw. But perhaps while the questions are coming, I can ask you one as well, which is, if you could, I'd like to invite you to sort of speak a little bit about the concept of time. I know that you so beautifully, especially in the example of Ruknabad, talk to us about the here and now, and the idea of place, which is so evocative, and you discuss this in your book as well in great detail. And I was thinking of the different registers of time that also come through in these poems that you discuss. One, of course, is historical time, you know, this world that is in some sense changed entirely, both linguistically and just in terms of just, you know, the ways in which Shiraz, the city, or the social system, the political system has altered. So that's one type of time that sort of comes through in the poems. Of course, the one you already mentioned, metaphorical time, which is, you know, this existential aspect of life and death, and the Sufi mystical overtones that are there. And then the third that I thought of thinking about another Shirazi poem from the period that I work on, Abdi Beg Shirazi, and his work on the seasons, you know, that Paul Lozensky has written about, and so on. So I was wondering if you could speak about these multiple registers of time, you know, within these works that you might have come across.
Mm-hmm. Well, about half of my book, which I didn't really talk about today, is focused on the rhetorical device particularly strong in Persian poetry, called talmih, yeah. Which roughly means allusion when used in poetry to a sometimes historical figure of the past, a legendary or mythical figure of the past, or even a literary character, and quite often, of course, also prophets and other important figures who are mystical guides, etc. And talmih is a way, and I think I've shown quite clearly in my book, is a way in which, as it is used by Hafiz and other poets who are active around him, is a way in which they bring not only the kind of past alive in a way, but make sense of the present through going back to at least the way in which they viewed the ancient past. Now, of course, as anyone would know, as any undergraduate student would know, the way in which we tend to try and divide nowadays between what we see as history and myth, or history and legend, is very unhelpful. It's very difficult to get into the mindset of the middle of the 14th century to think, you know, how was someone like Hafiz, or maybe even more importantly, how were his key patrons and his key audiences, how were they thinking about time? How were they thinking about the past? But he uses that talmih so often in order to say things about his present. Mm-hmm. Now, in part, that might be because he was fascinated with history, with legend, with, you know, the Shiraz is surrounded. I showed in that
exactly.
The map, you know, the more close-up map of Shiraz. It's surrounded by ancient sites, by Sasanian and by Achaemenid ruined sites. So you know, if you're in Shiraz, you know, even nowadays, if you're in that part of Iran, you can't ignore the past, even if you don't necessarily understand it particularly well, and even if people in the 13th and 14th century living in Shiraz understood their past in a quite different way, they couldn't ignore, you know, the monuments to it.
Right.
So maybe that, of course, influences Hafez in particular to use at least ancient ideas and ancient stories in his poetry. But it might, of course, also be the fact that at least when he began his career, or when he had only just begun it, so at the beginning of the Muzaffarid reign, when we're told, I mentioned in my talk, that Mubaraz ad-Din is not meant to have been interested in literature and poetry. I mean, there is quite a lot of panegyric poetry has survived in praise of Mubaraz ad-Din, so I'm not sure how much that's true. But he does seem, by most accounts, to have been, quite a severe person, and not have created an atmosphere that was open necessarily to poets, or poets being free in the way that they spoke. Hafez is known for his criticism of hypocrisy, that he does in a very particular way through particular characters. So he obviously wasn't afraid of doing that. But, those characters can be dismissed as characters. And so maybe this use of Talamih and this use of the ancient past and ancient stories, that are, if they're from Iranian law, we know them most particularly through the Shahnameh. Maybe that was a way of talking about parallels and cognates in these stories that would allow him to critique a political present. But he is certainly interested, and poets of that period are certainly interested in trying to understand the relationship between a past and their present.
That's right. No, thank you so much. I mean, and I will save I have one more question, but I'm going to wait on that one. I have many, but I'm going to invite, before I open up the others, I'd like to invite Professor Abbas Amanet to maybe say a few words or jump in with a question of your own. And Parviz, sorry, Dominic, would you mind maybe if you stop sharing your screen, then we can see you better? Thank you. Professor Amanet.
I think you're still muted, Abbas. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Well, let me start by apologizing and then thanking Keshvar for giving me the chance to say a few words, and welcome Dominic to our Iran Colloquium Zoom session. It's wonderful on the occasion of publication of your book, long anticipated, to bring down Hafiz from the high cloud of what usually he has been located in the commentaries about his poetry, to earth, and to see him in a historical context, most significantly, and a literary context, both of them so much welcome. And I'm glad to see that there is a recognition of that as much as the award that you have received. This is quite a remarkable, in a sense, continuity in the study of. I would like to hear your views on that. In the study of Hafiz, how far are we really? How do you put your own work in the overall study of the classical 14th century poetry, and more specifically Hafiz? And this is the first point I would like to raise. And the second is that what you've just made a reference to about the patronage that Hafiz acknowledges in quite a number of his ghazals in a very humble fashion, which most of the time the interpreters would refer to as a, in a sense, and make sure that he would receive his financial pension or award from the reward from the patron. I think I would like to hear from you what you have to say about the fact that if you basically remove the last one or two verses, as you have pointed out in the first ghazal that you showed us, basically the rest of it remains intact, in a sense that the message that comes through is a complete message. most of the time, Hafiz, in effect, expresses views which are rather heretical by the Sharia standards of the time, in praise of wine drinking, in praise of music, in a sense, in its own language of allusions, to which you have also referred, bring ideas about the whole creation, the whole sacred history of the past, all of these. My point is that to what extent one can also interpret the acknowledgement of the patron as a way of protection and security against any possible criticism that no doubt there was, because he number of times in his Ghazals he points out to the sheikh and the rebuke of the sheikh. So it must have been some either general or specific criticism or denouncement of his poetry. In this regard, would it be part of, in a sense, trying to historicize Hafiz by putting more emphasis on the fact that, in effect, he presented himself as some kind of, if you like, social activist that talks about aspects of life that norms and the standards of strict religious practice naturally would not have acknowledged or appreciated?
It's an interesting question. I mean, maybe I'll talk about patronage first and then the other one. I mean, I think you're right. I mean, Hafiz was certainly a poet who was outspoken in a particular kind of way. Although I think, well, maybe the fact that he uses these characters that he criticizes allows him very often perhaps to also defend himself by saying, well, he could easily dismiss his own critique by saying, well, I'm not talking about a specific individual, I'm talking about a behavior. You know, they're not ad hominem attacks. They are quite different from the kinds of things you see in Hajj and in Suzani, for example. He doesn't engage in that kind of behavior, but maybe because he couldn't, and that probably tells you something about the atmosphere of the time. It was more conservative, so he does need the protection of Shah Shuja. I think the part of the reason I chose that particular panegyric for Hafiz, by Hafiz for Shah Shuja, is that you cannot remove the panegyric from it, because it opens in praise of Shah Shuja and it ends in praise of Shah Shuja, and the whole rhyme scheme is based on Shuja, right? So that is a very good example of how even those who, because we know from the manuscripts that quite a few of the fairly early ones, you find poems, panegyric ghazals, that in their most original form, as far as we understand, do have an ending line or two lines of dua for the patron, or a dua and then a request, or a dua and an instance of fakhr. But in the version that is in a lot of these manuscripts, where that poem exists, the patronage bait has been removed, especially if it's the last one, you know, that came after the takhallus. It's just been removed. So there was definitely an attempt, I guess, but that's probably more to do with this veneration of Hafiz and the development in the Timurid period of the divan as an object that has a magical power. You know, it's probably somehow related to that behavior. But I chose the poem that I did, and there are a number of them for Shah Shuja that are of that type, where really you cannot remove Shah Shuja from the poem. And so, yes, he needed the protection. You know, the very fascinating thing about Hafiz, of course, although he's also not unique in this regard in his time, but one of the most fascinating things about him is that he insists on doing everything that he does in poetry, in really, almost without exception, in the form of the Ghazal. If he wants to do things which appear to be really straightforwardly mystical, he of course chooses Ghazal. But if he wants to do panegyric, he rarely seems to have chosen Qasideh, although it's abundantly written by his contemporaries. Salman is full of Qasideh. Obaid Zarqani wrote a good number of Qasideh. Khaja Kermani wrote a huge amount of Qasideh, right? But Hafiz chooses not to do that. He does panegyric in Ghazal. He does everything in Ghazal. And he does it in a way that is so complex that it is very difficult to remove one thing from another, however hard we maybe try. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question about the role of patronage in his poetry. In terms of my own work, I'm not sure. I mean, there aren't enough monographs really written on Hafiz in any language. So I think I made a contribution there. What I have tried, if you do look at the book, if anyone looks at the book, what I really tried to do is use and not just refer to, but engage with a lot of the scholarship from Iran itself in Persian, which I think has been very lacking very often in Western studies of Persian poets, not by everyone, but by many. That's gladly that's changing nowadays. But there's a lot of good work done on the Ghazal as a form, and also a lot of important work done on Hafiz in particular in Persian that I've tried to bring into my own work. So in a way, I try to place myself, between two traditions. At least that's the aim.
If
I may interject. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead, please. Yes.
Thank you, Abbas, because we have a few questions here from the audience.
Yes.
Yes, that I would like to turn to, and then maybe we can return for some closing remarks. One is from my colleague, Pamela Karimi. Hello, Pamela. And she says that it's a fascinating talk. Have you done any comparative studies with other culturally booming cities at the time? For example, Florence and the patronage of the Medicis, and because one of the things I do admire, Dominic, about your work, and you state this right in front, is that you're coming at it as a comparativist. So how broad does this comparison go?
Yeah, well, again, I mean, it's very difficult for me to explain here, but if you look at the way in which I have tried to write about Shiraz or about any particular aspect of what I'm looking at, I have been as broad as I find useful in terms of not only looking geographically broadly. I mentioned something from the study of Japanese poetry that I found particularly important for understanding the way in which Ruknabad and Mosala work. The idea of a city-state and how city-states work and how they see themselves is both important in the Renaissance world, but also in the ancient Greek world. There's some of that in my work. I'm very interested in I guess, a kind of amateur way in art history. There is a lot of, secondary literature from Islamic art history, but also slightly broader in the work that I've done to try and really, not be talking in a vacuum in a way. And not only be talking even within, Persian literary studies. I know Arabic very well. I use Arabic in my research, and I, try to look across Ottoman and Arabic literature and the study of Urdu, etc., in the way that I'm trying to look at Persian, to create a sense, I guess, as someone who did work within a comparative literature department, but really to try and kind of open the discussion up rather than what seems to often happen, which is to kind of narrow it down.
That's right. That's right. No, and I think the question that Pamela is also alluding to is that there is more and more work thinking. It's very problematic to use a term like global in this context, which I think I find very But how do we think about connections that are being wrought? But that again, we could keep on talking about this for a long time, but I want to first do justice to our audience. An anonymous attendee has thanked you for your lecture, and their question relates to reception. You describe the various levels between artful imitation and mimicry, and they're curious as to whose opinion determined the poet's success or legitimation. For example, if an established poet engaged with a newcomer's poetry, was that a sign of approval?
Yes, I would say so. I mean, if we go back to the relationship between Hafiz and Jahan, shown in the example that I gave from that poem, I think Hafiz is quoting her, and that says a lot, partly about the quality of her poetry, the similarity of her use of Ghazal. She's somehow, if you read her divan, is somehow positioned perhaps between Saadi and Hafiz, but there is quite a lot of evidence, at least in the more technical side of the way in which she uses the Ghazal, which has overlap with Hafiz. If he is quoting her, then he is giving, he is praising and elevating her poetic output. Of course, she, was an injured princess, but managed to maintain a social status in Shiraz under the Muzaffarids. Right. So she is of a particular class that Hafiz himself doesn't belong to, but Hafiz interacts with. So, I mean, there is some favor being given from Hafiz towards her by quoting her. But in terms of her social status, she is far more important than he is, potentially. So there is also some benefit to him. I mean, it is the literary aspects of imitation, the literary sides of imitation, who decides what is imitated, and therefore what is remembered, what is seen to have impact. These are questions, I guess, amongst poets. But when you look at it from outside and you look at that particular kind of example, there seems to be a very clear kind of transaction in terms of status between the two. Right. There's a very one of these poets, and named in the last slide that I put up, I think it is Jalal. No, it's not Jalal. It's someone who calls himself Ruh-e-Attar or Attar-e-Shirazi, who is a minor poet but has some interesting poems. And he has two poems in which he says he has been asked, presumably in Shiraz, that he has been asked to compare the eloquence of Hafiz with Salman. Now, unfortunately, today we don't really think about comparing the eloquence of Hafiz with anyone. And we certainly, if we were going to do it, probably wouldn't compare it with Salman, even though Salman is a great poet in many ways. But it is fascinating that Attar, who is not particularly important, this Ruh-e-Attar or Attar-e-Shirazi, is saying, I have been asked on presumably more than one occasion, how do I rate these two? And he's speaking in Shiraz. And in Shiraz, he says, in both of these poems, well, they're essentially as eloquent as one another. Their poetry is of a comparable quality and level, which is fascinating, given that he didn't say it in Baghdad, where Salman is. He said it in Shiraz. I mean, it tells you something, maybe, although I talked a lot about competition and rivalry, it maybe tells you something about actually collaborative work or respect of these, that these poets had for one another when they were certainly at the height of their game. If we look in some of the earliest manuscripts where Hafiz's poetry exists, you do find sometimes his poetry in the margins with Salman's at the center. That is also shows you a lot about how these poets were seen closer to the time in which they lived. The problem of writing about Hafiz is that there is so much hagiography, there is so much overstatement of poetic talent that it is very difficult to make these comparisons and to be taken seriously when you make them.
But I think in many ways, that's what enriches him even more. You know, I mean, in some sense, calling the prophet unlettered makes him more interesting as a human, what he achieves, right? So when you take, as you do, Hafiz down from his pedestal, actually, and see him within his milieu, he's actually a much more full figure. It gives us a little bit more depth to what he's doing and who he's speaking with, in my opinion. There's a wonderful question that's come up about what and if does this, to what extent does this poetry exist outside the court, if at all? And I'm thinking here, perhaps you could speak, in my mind immediately, the Fatimid poems came up, which is thinking of being in the city of Cairo and the use of humor and all of that comes in. And do you see something like that happening in Shiraz at this time?
It's difficult to say. I mean, it is certainly a poetry that is produced primarily for elites and often by elites. But having said that, Shiraz is a medieval or a pre-modern city.
Yeah.
People were not separate from one another in the way that they are today, right? If Shiraz had suburbs, which it did, they were gardens. They weren't places that people lived. People lived right next to one another. They had households that contained people of all manner of description, background, community, religion, maybe, ethnicity as we understand it now, right? I mean, there's a phenomenon up until certainly the late 19th century in Iran, if not the early 20th century. So the idea that even if something, when it is produced, its initial and primary audience or zone for reception is elite, the idea that that can somehow be sealed off and away from people who are not part of that class is a fallacy.
Right.
At the same time,
yeah,
we don't really see that crossover, certainly not in the poetry of Hafiz, but one of the other people I put into this list, and I do look at in my book, is the popular preacher Junaid Shirazi. And Junaid has a good amount of poetry, of erotic, or at least on the surface, erotic Ghazal poetry, which presumably he used in his sermons, or he used in some way in relation to his sermons. And, that is, although he's probably one of those figures that Hafiz was attacking, or the kind of figure that he was attacking when he attacks the popular preacher and he attacks the Va'iz. But the Va'iz himself, at least in this period, was not immune to the beauty of poetry or the usefulness of poetry in arousing particular emotions in his listeners. So, I mean, there is a crossover, which is not necessarily to do with the court. Junaid himself would be considered an elite of a particular type, not necessarily courtly, but he was presumably preaching to people who are of a lower social status, and using poetry that is very similar or is somehow an imitation of the courtly.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Hadi Jurati, an old friend of this department in our milieu, has asked at least 3 questions here, but I think I'm going to ask you just one. If you could say more about other Persian-speaking notables in Baghdad.
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of, Salman is at the Jalayirid court, and Baghdad in this period, not exclusively, but primarily really in terms of how it interacts with poetry and panegyric, is very heavily Persian, at least, right? One thing that is not necessarily an answer to Hadi, but one of those things that you see in Salman's poetry is, when you know the poetry of Shiraz very well, is sometimes the way in which he talks about Baghdad, and he talks about the rivers in Iraq, and he talks about the gardens alongside the rivers, etc., is so similar to Ruknabad, is so similar to the way in which Shiraz is conceptualized within Shirazi poetry, but he is saying it about Baghdad. And quite often in his poetry, he not only does that, he talks about Persian wine, which is you could see that even as a a kind of imitation of Abbasid, much earlier Abbasid Arabic poetry. But he does it in a way that is quite similar to what is happening in Shiraz. But of course, he has a lot of panegyrics, and he calls the Jalayirid king, the Jalayirid ruler, very often the king of Iran, right? He relates, although I do believe in relation to the poetry of Shiraz, Jamshid and by extension Solomon have a particular meaning, but Salman also uses those. Sometimes in a dismissive way, which maybe you could read as a way of dismissing what is happening in Shiraz, but he often praises his ruler in a way that is exactly the same as any other local ruler within, the Iranian plateau. And so, even though Arabic would have been more important in many ways in contexts which are not to do with religion per se, in Baghdad as opposed to some other places. Baghdad is very much within that same Persian sphere at the time. And these poets are, directly responding to one another in a way as equals, as partners, as colleagues in a sense.
Yeah. No, thank you. So there are a few more questions, but I'm going to ask one of them, which is, I guess, sort of underlies your project, is to sort of maybe speak a little bit about this after history of Hafiz. Mm-hmm. So somebody working on the Safavid period, he is monumental, right? I mean, in many ways, he is the epitome, but as you said as well, he, starts to appear. We have all these manuscripts that are illustrated, and I wish you were at Yale. We would love to show you some of our sort of minor texts, but inshallah, another time. But, he is, it's almost like snowballing. But the way that we understand Hafiz today, and then I think as Saim Al-Kaya asks, how did the Fale Hafiz come into being? Mm-hmm. So if you could speak a little bit more, and you can choose which next moment you want to think about, the Safavids or the 20th century, or whichever one you like.
Sure. Well, the Fale Hafiz is very old. It's not a new thing. But it is most likely really an invention or something that takes shape in the Timurid period. Yeah. Because it is related to the Divan. And the Divan is not a product of the time of Hafiz. It is a product of the Timurid period as far as we understand. Yeah. That is a very interesting thing about Hafiz, is that unlike many of the poets who I've listed here, who are active in the 14th century, he is not thought to have compiled his own divan. Many of them not only compiled their divan or their kulliyat, but they had multiple kind of divans of ghazals in different periods of their life, apparently, right? So he's very different in that sense. And maybe ironically, his divan is the one that then takes on this magical aspect to it. So it's fascinating. I mean, people have written on that. It's not something I have worked on.
Yes, here, just a moment.
Please.
Even the title, Lisanul Ghaib, seems to be something that emerges rather early. Am I right?
It emerges early, but we're not sure whether it's contemporary to him.
No. Okay.
Because it is mentioned in there is certainly something that is happening in the Timurid period, which is different with Hafiz as opposed to some of these other, or most of these other poets.
Because this also speaks to this kind of a talismanic aspect of his poetry. This is
something that is miraculous, sure. Yeah. Something that is almost akin to revelation. I mean, all of these things start to be said. Another way of pulling back from that when you try to study him is to look at the last poet that I've listed on the list of poets, the Boshaq at Emel, Boshaq Shirazi, who is very difficult to read unless you have a nice glossary. But this poet who bridges between the kind of very late Muzaffarid, really the early decades of the Timurid period, is an imitator. but he's the imitator of in an amusing way that he imitates famous poems of the 14th and 13th century primarily, but also some other ones, but makes them about food and food culture rather than anything else, right? But there, Bosraq, he does imitate Hafiz, but he doesn't necessarily imitate Hafiz much more or necessarily even more than a group of other poets. And he doesn't necessarily imitate poems by Hafiz that we now consider to be particularly mystical, whatever that means, right?
Yes.
So in order to get past these layers that happen in the Timurid period, you have to go back and back, and actually using someone like Bosraq tells you probably a lot about how Hafiz is being read in 1390 when he dies, in 1400, etc. I mean, the thing is that what happens in the Safavid period is dependent on the way in which Hafiz is as a commodity and his divan is developed in the Timurid period. But something again that I mentioned, that what Shami So talks about, this excessive kind of obsession Hafiz seems to have with not simply imitating, but kind of giving hints that he is drawing from all these different poets of all these different periods, who interestingly write or are known for forms and genres different to his own.
Yeah.
That's something he does as well, very skillfully. Is that Hafiz then becomes a kind of library, right? He becomes a kind of Bible in that sense. Because if you read Hafiz and if you get deeply into Hafiz in a way that is primarily literary, maybe, rather than looking at it as something more esoteric or mystical, it is a way into, which if it's used even with undergraduate or graduate students, it's a way into the literary history of what came before him, right?
Right.
So I guess in the Safavid period, an obsession with Hafiz is really an obsession in a way with a particular kind of way of reading the Persian literary past, because it is a window into all of that came before him. You see what I mean?
Fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for that. And because of course he's also completely decontextualized one more time in the visual language, right? It starts with the Timurids, but really by the middle of the 16th century is when we see Safavid hagiographies and all kinds of different manuscripts in which you'll have a Quranic verse and then you'll have a Hafiz couplet or just a line pulled out, and it'll be an image about, Ali. But, so there's just this interesting layering that happens with Hafiz as well, which I find so fascinating. And there's also this idea that not only is he sort of an illusion in and of himself becomes an illusion, right? But that also he's sometimes being misunderstood entirely, perhaps, right? I mean,
Sure.
But that's which doesn't matter in any judgmental type.
But I think it's intentional on his part. I mean, I say in my book, in the introduction and in various places, this, not just the Hafiz, but the fact that he focuses so deliberately on the Ghazal exacerbates this, and the way in which he produces a very complex, layered Ghazal that you do see a little bit earlier on, but he's the master of that, is very intentional. The ambiguity, the difficulty we have not only reading Hafiz, but translating Hafiz is almost an impossible thing to do, because there is so much intentional multiple meaning, multiple reference, multiple things which are being signified, which are being brought into the conversation. But that's intentional on his part. He must have edited his poetry very heavily. He doesn't have very much poetry, considering that he was active as a poet probably for at least 40, if not more years. He only has, less than 500 poems, 500 ghazals. It's not a huge amount for someone who is so convinced also of his erudition and his skill as a poet. So he must have edited a lot, and that editing also leads to these very complex texts. In part, maybe because and we don't know if this is true or not, but in part because other performance versions of the same text, or other drafts of the same text, or other variants of the same text would have been lost, of course, in that process. And that a poem that today now seems extremely complex to us, to his immediate audience, if they were aware of an earlier iteration of the same poem, would not seem so complex, because they would be able to fill in, the gaps from their previous knowledge.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, that's, it's an impossible thing for us to tease apart, but it makes sense.
It's true, but this impossibility you have made possible. Really, I have to congratulate you, Dominic, for this really wonderful book. Once again, I'm going to do the plug, and Hafiz and his Contemporaries. It's an incredibly interesting and important book, and it's an incredible contribution to the study of Persian literary and culture, cultural history itself. So, Abbas, with your permission, I'm going to Dominic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for great questions.
We're so grateful to have you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.